In the heart of Frederick, Colorado, a quiet town where families walk dogs after dinner and children ride bikes through cul-de-sacs, stood a beautiful two-story home. Tan walls, white trim, a broad driveway where a silver Lexus was usually parked. It was the Watts family residence. And for many neighbors scrolling through Facebook, it was a window into what looked like the perfect American life. Shanann Watts, 34, was radiant, charismatic, confident, and endlessly upbeat. Her social media presence glowed with positivity. Every photo showed joy. Her two daughters, Bella and Celeste, giggling in their matching dresses, her husband, Chris, smiling beside her. They were the kind of family people admired. And that's what makes what happened next so unthinkable. Because behind that carefully curated image, beneath the smiling photos and "I love my husband" posts, was a truth so dark that it would end in one of the most shocking family murders in modern history. To understand the tragedy, we must begin with Shanann Watts, a woman whose strength had been tested long before she met Chris Watts. Born in North Carolina in 1984, Shanann grew up in a modest home with her parents, Frank and Sandra, and her younger brother, Frankie. She was smart, driven, and fiercely independent. But life wasn't always kind to her. In her early 20s, Shanann was diagnosed with lupus, an autoimmune disease that often left her exhausted and in pain. She described it as a daily battle. But rather than slow down, she pushed harder, working multiple jobs, building her confidence, and refusing to be defined by her illness. It was during this time, around 2010, that she met Chris Watts. He was quiet, almost shy, the opposite of her vibrant personality. And that difference drew her in. Shanann later said she almost ignored his friend request on Facebook. But something, a gut feeling, maybe, made her accept it. They began talking, then dating. And in Chris, she found someone who seemed steady, dependable, loyal. He drove from Colorado to North Carolina just to see her. He listened. He cared. And when her lupus symptoms worsened, he stayed. To Shanann, that meant everything. In November 2012, the couple married in Charlotte, North Carolina. The ceremony was intimate, family, friends, a few tears, and plenty of laughter. Shanann wore a white lace gown and smiled from ear to ear. Chris, reserved as always, looked almost overwhelmed by the moment. After their wedding, they decided to move west to Colorado. Shanann wanted a fresh start, and Chris had secured a steady job at Anadarko Petroleum. They bought their dream home on 2825 Saratoga Trail in a brand new subdivision in Frederick. The $400,000 house was modern and spacious, for bedrooms, a finished basement, and a backyard perfect for children. Soon after moving in, Shanann gave birth to Bella Marie in December 2013. Then, 2 years later, to Celeste Catherine, nicknamed Cece. From the outside, the family flourished. Shanann became a full-time promoter for a health supplement company, Thrive, which gave her the flexibility to work from home and be with her kids. She was known for her vibrant energy, recording upbeat videos of her daughters and sharing motivational posts about family, health, and love. But behind those videos, finances were tight. In 2015, just 2 years after moving in, the Watts family filed for bankruptcy. Between the mortgage, car loans, credit card debt, and student loans, they owed nearly $500,000. Still, Shanann pushed on, optimistic, determined, refusing to show weakness. And Chris? He remained calm and quiet, avoiding confrontation at all costs. It seemed like a balanced partnership, but that silence, that emotional distance, was slowly eroding the foundation beneath their marriage. Chris was the listener, the doer, the one who nodded and agreed. But internally, he had begun to retreat. Friends of the couple noticed it. At parties, Shanann would be lively and outgoing, while Chris lingered on the sidelines, smiling but rarely speaking. He was polite but detached. Some thought that was just his personality, a quiet man married to an extroverted woman. But to those closest to them, the emotional imbalance was clear. Shanann often gushed about Chris online, calling him her rock, her biggest blessing. But privately, she expressed worry. He was changing, becoming colder, distant. By early 2018, the warmth had all but vanished. In the spring of 2018, Chris met Nicole Kessinger, a coworker at Anadarko. Nicole was intelligent, independent, and confident, someone who took pride in her work. She met Chris while he was servicing an environmental control system. He told her he was separated, that he and his wife were in the process of divorcing. It was a lie, but one that Nicole had no reason to doubt at first. Chris began changing almost immediately. He started working out intensely, losing weight, eating healthier, buying new clothes. His colleagues noticed the transformation. He seemed happier, energized. At home, Shanann saw it too, but for her, it was a red flag. She once told a friend, "Something's off. He's not himself. He's working out, shaving his body hair, dressing differently. And he doesn't touch me anymore." As their 10th wedding anniversary approached, Shanann began planning a surprise, a romantic getaway to rekindle their spark. But Chris was emotionally gone. He was living two lives. To understand Chris Watts, we must explore not just what he did, but why. Psychologists who later studied his behavior described a man with pathological passivity. He wasn't violent or cruel by nature, at least not outwardly. Instead, he was conflict avoidant to an extreme degree. Chris had spent his life pleasing others, doing what was expected, suppressing discomfort, avoiding arguments. But years of silence had built up resentment, shame, and frustration. When the affair began, it awakened something dormant. Nicole gave him attention, admiration, the feeling of being wanted for who he was, not what he provided. And for the first time, Chris tasted control. He began imagining a life without responsibilities, without judgment, just him and Nicole, starting over. But instead of facing his problems, he started building a fantasy that would soon demand a horrifying price. In late June 2018, Shanann noticed the emotional distance becoming unbearable. Chris no longer touched her. When she tried to hug him, he stiffened. When she spoke of their future, he turned away. She confided in friends, telling one of them, "I don't know who he is anymore." Still, she hoped the problem could be fixed. That summer, she traveled with Bella and Cece to North Carolina to visit her family for 6 weeks. Chris stayed behind for work. During those weeks, he grew even closer to Nicole. They went on dates to the mountains and shared countless messages. Shanann, meanwhile, was texting Chris constantly, trying to keep their connection alive. But his replies were distant, mechanical. At one point, she wrote, "I miss you so much. I can't wait to be home with you." And he responded, "Me too." Just 2 words, cold, detached, and hollow. By the time Shanann returned home in early August, she could feel the emotional wall between them. She confronted Chris, asking if he still loved her. He said he didn't know. That was the beginning of the end. Friends later said Shanann seemed anxious, heartbroken, but determined to save her marriage. She scheduled counseling sessions and wrote long, emotional messages trying to reconnect. But for Chris, the fantasy of his new life had already taken root. He began researching topics like divorce with children and how to start a new life. At the same time, he was telling Nicole that his marriage was almost over. He even discussed selling the house and starting over with her. But deep down, he knew none of that could happen cleanly. He was drowning in lies, to Shanann, to Nicole, to everyone around him. And that's when something inside him began to fracture completely. In early August, Shanann discovered she was pregnant. It wasn't planned, but she was thrilled. She shared the news with Chris in a video, holding up a pregnancy test and saying, "Guess what?" Chris smiled faintly, then said, "That's awesome." But his eyes told a different story. He didn't want another child. Not now. Not when he was planning to leave. Later, Shanann texted a friend. "He's acting weird. I told him we're having another baby, and he barely reacted. I don't know what's going on with him." She named the unborn child Nico Lee Watts. In her mind, he was the symbol of new beginnings. For Chris, he became something else entirely. Another weight, another tie to the life he wanted to escape. By August 11th, Shanann flew to Arizona for a business trip. She texted Chris throughout, sending loving messages, trying to spark conversation. He barely responded. When she told a friend that Chris had told her he didn't want the baby, she said quietly, "He said he feels trapped, but I'll fight for my family." She had no idea that within 48 hours, her fight would be over. August 13th, 2018. A Monday morning like any other. The start of a new week in suburban Colorado. But for the Watts family, it was the morning the illusion finally collapsed. At 1:48 a.m., Shanann Watts returned home from a business trip to Arizona. Her friend, Nicole Atkinson, had driven her from the airport. Nicole later said Shanann was tired, but talkative. She seemed distracted. Her husband had been ignoring her messages all weekend. Before stepping out of the car, Shanann sighed and said, "Wish me luck. I have to talk to Chris." It was the last time anyone saw her alive. Inside the quiet house, the lights were dim. Chris was awake, waiting, not to reconcile, but to end everything. What happened inside that house between 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. has been pieced together through confessions, text data, and chilling reconstructions. Shanann likely went upstairs, set down her luggage, and checked on the girls. Then she entered the bedroom, where Chris was waiting. He told her he wanted a separation, that he didn't love her anymore, that he had met someone else. Shanann was devastated, shocked, angry, and heartbroken. She cried, asking how he could abandon his family. Chris later told investigators she accused him of cheating, and in that moment, he snapped. But the truth, according to forensic experts, shows premeditation. There were no signs of a struggle in the bedroom, no defensive wounds. And Shanann's Fitbit stopped recording movement at exactly 2 a.m. That was the moment Chris Watts strangled his pregnant wife. He placed her lifeless body face down on the bed, wrapped her in a bedsheet, and left her there. Down the hall, their daughters, Bella and Celeste, had likely woken up from a noise. They saw their mother's body. Chris told them she was sick. Then he began loading his truck, methodically, quietly. At 5 a.m., home surveillance footage from the neighbor's camera showed Chris backing his truck into the driveway, something he had never done before. He carried out 3 things. First, a white bedsheet. Then, Shanann's body covered. And finally, 2 small figures, Bella and Celeste, alive but terrified. He drove east for about 45 minutes into the empty plains of Weld County toward a remote oil site called Survey 319, where he worked. The ride must have been silent, except for the faint, confused voices of the girls asking questions he didn't answer. "What's wrong with Mommy? Are you mad at her?" Chris would later tell investigators that Bella, the older one, held her little sister's hand the entire ride. When they arrived, the sun was beginning to rise. He parked near the oil tanks. There, in the quiet of dawn, Chris Watts did the unthinkable. He smothered Celeste, age 3, using her blanket. Then turned to Bella, age 4. Bella fought back. Her autopsy revealed injuries to her mouth, signs she tried to scream through the blanket. Her last words were, "Daddy, no." He then stuffed their small bodies into separate 8-inch openings on the top of the oil tanks. The crude oil would disguise the smell and hasten decomposition. He buried Shanann nearby in a shallow grave, placing the sheet from their bed over her. By 7:45 a.m., he texted his coworkers casually, claiming he'd check a leak at Survey 319. Then he returned home, took a shower, and pretended nothing had happened. Around 9 a.m., Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson began to worry. Shanann had missed her prenatal appointment, something she would never do. Nicole texted and called her repeatedly. No response. By noon, Nicole drove to the Watts residence. She knocked, rang the doorbell, and peeked through the windows. Inside, she could see Shanann's car still in the garage, and her shoes near the door. It didn't make sense. She called the police. At 1:48 p.m., Officer Scott Coonrod of the Frederick Police Department arrived for a welfare check. Bodycam footage from that moment would later go viral. Chris arrived minutes later, acting calm but strangely detached. He greeted the officer politely, shook his hand, and unlocked the door. Inside, Shanann's purse, phone, and medication were still there. The beds were neatly made, except the master bed, missing its sheets. Nicole's voice trembled as she said, "This is so unlike her." Chris nodded, pacing back and forth, occasionally checking his phone. He mentioned that Shanann might have gone somewhere, but didn't explain how, since her car and belongings were still there. By the next day, the story hit local news. Pregnant Frederick woman and 2 daughters missing. Cameras appeared on the Watts' front lawn. Chris gave an on-camera interview, his demeanor eerily flat. Shanann, Bella, Cece, if you're out there, just come back. The house isn't the same without you. He spoke without tears, his arms folded, eyes darting nervously. To most viewers, it seemed like a grieving husband's plea. But to trained observers and to the detectives watching closely, his behavior was off. He smiled at odd moments. He spoke about the house instead of my family. And he didn't ask if they were safe, only that they come back. To his neighbor, Nathan Trinastick, something felt wrong. After police left, Nathan showed officers his home security footage, which captured Chris backing his truck into the driveway that morning. Chris stood nearby as the footage played. His face was pale. He crossed his arms and rocked back and forth. When the video ended, Nathan turned to the officer and whispered, "He's not acting right. He's never backed his truck up like that before." That was the first real crack in his story. Within 48 hours, investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation (CBI) and the FBI joined the search. Their first step, digital forensics. They obtained cell phone data, GPS records, and text messages. Almost immediately, inconsistencies appeared. Chris claimed he didn't know where Shanann went, but his phone showed no calls to her after she disappeared. He said they'd had an emotional conversation that morning, but neighbors never heard anything. Meanwhile, the scent-tracking dogs alerted near the master bedroom and the staircase, signaling a possible body had been moved. Then came the moment that sealed his fate. Investigators found that Chris had been having an affair. When confronted, he downplayed it. But phone records proved extensive contact with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, including hours-long phone calls and searches like how to start a new life. Nicole herself would later say she had no idea his wife was pregnant. The case was turning rapidly. By August 15th, detectives invited Chris to the Frederick Police Department for questioning. He went voluntarily, confident he could maintain his story. Detective Tammy Lee began the interview. Her tone was calm, maternal, but firm. "Chris, you're not under arrest. We just need your help understanding what's going on." He repeated his story. Shanann came home late, they argued, and when he left for work the next morning, she and the girls were gone. Tammy watched his body language carefully. He avoided eye contact. He spoke in short, rehearsed sentences. His emotions seemed muted, like he was describing someone else's family. After hours of questioning, she offered him a polygraph test. He agreed. Before starting, Tammy warned him, "If you did have anything to do with their disappearance, now is the time to be honest." He said, "I had nothing to do with it." The test began, but it didn't take long. When it ended, Tammy re-entered the room and said, with quiet finality, "Chris, we both know you failed that polygraph." His face drained of color. He leaned forward, whispering, "I didn't hurt them." Tammy pressed on, gently but relentlessly. "Chris, when we tell you that you failed, that means you did not tell the truth. Help us find your girls." He asked for his father, Ronnie Watts. When Ronnie entered, Chris broke. He whispered through tears, "Dad, I messed up." But even then, he lied. He claimed that Shanann had killed the girls, and in a fit of rage, he killed her. Investigators knew instantly it wasn't true, but they let him talk. Within hours, faced with mounting evidence, Chris finally confessed. He had killed them all. That night, August 15th, detectives drove Chris to the Survey 319 oil site. Under police escort, he pointed out where he had buried Shanann, a shallow grave just east of the tanks. Nearby, investigators found 2 large oil tanks. Inside each, submerged in crude oil, were the bodies of Bella and Celeste. It took hours to remove them. The stench of oil mixed with decay hung in the air. Seasoned officers wept. Back at the command center, the news reached Shanann's family in North Carolina. Her father collapsed. Her mother screamed. Her brother, Frankie, later wrote, "I will never forget the pain in my parents' eyes that night. Our lives ended too. The confession sent shockwaves across the country. People who had followed Shanann's cheerful Facebook videos couldn't believe it. There she was, smiling, dancing with her daughters, calling Chris the best husband ever. And yet, that same man had murdered her. True crime experts began dissecting his behavior. Why did he do it? How could a seemingly gentle man slaughter his family so coldly? Psychologists called it family annihilation syndrome. In such cases, the perpetrator, usually a man, feels trapped between financial stress, infidelity, and perceived failure. Rather than face shame, he wipes out the family to start fresh. But Chris Watt's case stood out. He showed no history of abuse, no violent past. Just an emptiness, a chilling, emotional void. In the days after his confession, Nicole Kessinger came forward to police. Her interviews revealed a man who had manipulated everyone around him. She told detectives, "He told me they were separated. He never mentioned Shanann was pregnant. I found out on the news." When she confronted him by text, he wrote, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone." Public outrage was instant. Social media turned vicious, especially against Nicole, who faced threats despite her cooperation. She later went into hiding. Meanwhile, Shanann's family prepared for the funeral of their daughter, granddaughters, and unborn grandson Nico. The coffins, 3 white, 1 small pink, were laid side by side. A community mourned in silence. A friend of Shanann said during the service, "She believed in family. She believed in love. And even after death, her light will outshine his darkness." Chris Watts was charged with 9 counts, including 3 counts of first-degree murder, unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased body. Prosecutors initially considered seeking the death penalty. But after discussions with Shanann's family, they chose a plea deal, sparing him execution in exchange for full guilty pleas. On November 19, 2018, he was sentenced to 5 life terms without parole, plus 84 additional years. Judge Marcelo Kopkow said in court, "The most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled in my career." Chris showed little emotion as the sentence was read. He merely looked down, avoiding the gaze of Shanann's family. When the courtroom fell silent on November 19, 2018, the world finally saw the real Chris Watts, not the calm husband from the TV interviews, not the quiet mechanic from Frederick, Colorado, but the man who had murdered his pregnant wife and 2 little girls in cold blood. He stood before the judge, head down, shackled, hands trembling slightly. The family sat behind him, Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandy Razusek, clutching each other's hands, their faces carved with grief. When the judge read out the sentence, 5 life terms without the possibility of parole, there was no emotion from Chris. No tears. No outburst. Just silence. But it wasn't over, because in the months that followed, the truth, the real truth, would come out. And it would be even darker than anyone imagined. After his sentencing, Chris Watts was taken to Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security prison. At first, he kept to himself. He was placed in protective custody, away from other inmates. He read the Bible daily. He prayed. He said he'd found God. But investigators weren't convinced that repentance had replaced deception. There were still too many unanswered questions, too many lies left unaccounted for. In February 2019, just 3 months after sentencing, agents from the FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation flew to Wisconsin. They wanted to know why. They wanted to hear the story straight from his mouth. No lawyers, no cameras, no media. What Chris told them would stun even the most experienced detectives. For the first time, Chris Watts gave a detailed confession of what happened on the morning of August 13, 2018. His voice was flat, his words deliberate, as if he were describing someone else's crime. He said Shanann came home around 2 a.m. from her business trip. They had an emotional conversation, one that turned into an argument. She accused him of cheating. He admitted it. She told him he'd never see the kids again. And then he snapped. He got on top of her and strangled her. As she fought for her life, he said she didn't scream, only murmured, "Chris, no." When it was over, he sat there, staring at her body. Then, from the doorway, came a tiny voice. "What's wrong with Mommy?" It was Bella. Her sister Cece was awake too. They had seen everything. Chris told investigators that he wrapped Shanann's body in a bedsheet, loaded it into the back of his work truck, and drove the girls, still alive, to a remote oil field nearly an hour away. There, in the rising dawn, surrounded by silence and steel tanks, he smothered them both. First Cece, then Bella. Bella's final words were a whisper. "Daddy, no." He placed their tiny bodies inside separate oil tanks, submerged in crude oil, to hide what he'd done. Then he dug a shallow grave for Shanann nearby. The scene he described was almost unbearable. Even the agents interviewing him had to pause, to breathe, to steady themselves. One later said, "It was like listening to a man describe erasing his own soul." What drives a man like Chris Watts? A seemingly loving father, no history of violence, no signs of rage, to commit such a calculated act? Psychologists who studied the case called it a family annihilation, a rare but deeply disturbing type of homicide in which a man kills his entire family to escape responsibility, shame, or exposure. Chris was described as a covert narcissist, someone who appears gentle and humble, but harbors deep insecurity and emotional emptiness. He sought validation through how others saw him. He lived for approval from his wife, from his lover, from his coworkers. And when his double life began to crumble, he saw only one way out: total destruction. Experts say he didn't kill out of rage. He killed out of fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being exposed as the failure he secretly believed he was. He wanted a new life, but not the consequences that came with choosing one. So, instead of facing the mess he'd made, he erased the people who reminded him of it. It wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of cowardice. While Chris began his life behind bars, Shanann's family faced the unthinkable. Life without Shanann, Bella, Cece, and baby Nico. Her parents, Frank and Sandy, became symbols of strength in the face of devastation. They spoke openly about forgiveness, not because Chris deserved it, but because hate would destroy them too. In one interview, Shanann's mother said softly, "I don't know if I'll ever understand why, but I have to believe they're at peace. That's all I can do." They've since dedicated their lives to speaking out about domestic abuse, manipulation, and the silent warning signs of control that often go unnoticed until it's too late. For them, Shanann's story isn't just about tragedy. It's about awareness. About listening when someone says they're scared, lonely, or confused in their own home. To this day, the Watts case continues to haunt the public consciousness, not because of how brutal it was, but because of how normal it seemed before it happened. There were no police calls, no violent outbursts, just a family that looked perfect. In a world ruled by images, social media had told a comforting story. Smiling photos, loving captions, family vacations. But as the investigation showed, those smiles can sometimes hide the deepest pain. Shanann once said in a Facebook video, "I have the best life. I am blessed beyond measure." And, in many ways, she believed it. She wanted it to be true. She fought every day to keep it that way. But while she fought to hold her family together, Chris was quietly planning how to destroy it. Chris Watts remains in a Wisconsin prison, serving his 5 consecutive life sentences. He spends most days alone in his cell, reading the Bible, writing letters, and occasionally corresponding with strangers who still reach out to him. He claims to have found faith, says he prays for forgiveness every day. But forgiveness, as Shanann's mother once said, doesn't mean freedom. It means letting go of hate. Psychologists who've spoken to him note that he still struggles to articulate why he did it. He talks about pressure, confusion, and feeling different, but never true remorse. Even in confession, he seemed detached, as if the man who killed his family was someone else entirely. And perhaps, in his fractured mind, that's exactly how he sees it. The Watts family murders are more than a crime story. They are a cautionary tale about appearances, isolation, and silence. About how quickly love can turn to possession. and how people can hide the darkest parts of themselves behind a smile. For every social media post that glows with happiness, there may be a quiet cry for help just beyond the frame. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: no life is perfect. No relationship is unbreakable. And no one, no matter how calm, polite, or quiet, is incapable of terrible things. Because evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico, 4 lives gone far too soon. But their light still shines through the people who remember them, and through the voices that refuse to let their story fade into silence. If this story gripped you like it did me, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more chilling true crime stories. This is True Crime Vault 360, where the past speaks, the truth breathes, and the shadows never stay silent.